Next up, we have the top aviation analysts on Wall Street, and I look forward to hearing their veteran take on current trends. Our moderator is Mike Miller, a longtime writer and consultant in aviation with his company, Miller Air Group. Mike is a gifted communicator who also brings keen insight into the regional side of the business and is known for asking insightful questions. Joining Mike are Mike Lindenberg, Managing Director of Deutsche Bank, a 30-year veteran of airline finance. Mike has been with Deutsche Bank for 13 years and previously with Merrill Lynch for 18 years. Helene Becker, Managing Director of TD Cowen, has more than 40 years experience on Wall Street, including roles with Citi, Lehman Brothers, and Smith Barney. She's been with TD Cowen for 10 years. And Savi Saith, Managing Director of Raymond James. Savi's worked with Raymond James for more than 12 years, and prior to that, Wells Capital Management and Strong Capital. I won't stand in the way of Mike and the panel of experts, but please join me in welcoming this panel. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Faye. Is the microphone on? Hello? Okay. I appreciate being here. Thank you, Faye, for the invitation. It's always great to be in an organization that really cares about this industry backwards and forwards. We have the top analysts on Wall Street, and it really is these three. And I'm thrilled that all three of them could be here. Maybe we could change the slide so that it shows it's correct there, but not here. Okay, it's correct for everybody else. So thank you, all of you, for being here. You have a wealth of knowledge for this business. You see the industry from a number of different perspectives. And while we are looking at the regional airline industry today in a lot of panels, I really would like this panel to look at all of the airlines, because you bring perspective about what the major carriers are doing, as well as how you view the regionals. So right now, to open up, everybody knows that the airline industry goes through cycles. When you look at the economic cycle that we're in now, where do you think the airline industry is right now? How healthy are we really?
Me first?
Sure.
Well, thanks for having me. And thanks for having me back. Last time I was here, I didn't get invited back for a decade. So I've seen this movie before. As Faye mentioned, I've been doing this for a really long time. So it's what goes around comes around. And my fear is, when I say I've seen this movie before, Brian mentioned the salaries that airlines, especially the bigger airlines, are paying their pilots. And when you start to think about just the annual pay increases that are being given out by the majors, and then how that's trickling down to the regionals, the concern I have is that aside from coming out of the pandemic, we've never had a period of time where we've seen revenue increases that big. We've seen huge cost increases, but we've never seen revenue increases that would be enough to cover those cost increases. And we have fuel that's being very volatile right now. Right. So my concern is that margins get squeezed because we're heading into a period of time where we don't know what the economy is going to look like, with student loan repayments resuming, with childcare expenses, given all the pandemic era support is going away. So my worry is that we're going to have second half of the decade a repeat of what we saw in the last decade.
Oh. Do you guys share the concern? I mean, is there a lot?
Yeah, no, for sure. Helene brings up some of the issues. And again, thanks, Faye, for inviting me to this event. I think that last time I was here was 2000, 2001. I was a kid then. I couldn't answer half the questions, which is probably why I wasn't asked back. So I think I'm better prepared this time. And thanks, Mike, for moderating this. But I think, big picture, when we think about, where we are in the cycle, I mean, we're 18 months into a tightening cycle. So, by all definitions, we are, classic late cycle, and a recession is right around the corner, right? Everybody's talking about that. The airline industry, though, to some extent, feels like it's divorced itself from the overall macro cycle, because when we look at the US airline industry, even the global airline industry, we're still recovering from COVID. We're actually still recovering from the last recession. And so I think that the key is that there were carriers through the downturn that used that as an opportunity to fix themselves. You know, the saying about never letting a good crisis go to waste. You had carriers that, you know, restructured and focused, or maybe refocused on things where they could make money. And so coming out of this downturn, it's really interesting because some airlines are actually doing quite well and some carriers are not. And it feels like that the carriers that aren't doing well maybe are most exposed to some of the things that Helene brought up about, you know, things with respect to student loan payments and credit card debt, you know, is at a 10-year high, and auto payment delinquencies are at a 10-year high on one hand, but then household net worth recently hit an all-time high. So we see this bifurcation, and our sense is that, all right, you want to be, if you're going to invest, because that's what we focus on, we talk to investors in the airline space, you want to invest in airlines that target the people who are doing better, you know, the part of society that is coming out of the downturn in pretty good shape, and maybe you want to veer away from the carriers who focus on the more price-sensitive customers.
Right. Savvy, you were invited back, so glad to see you again for the second year in a row.
I appreciate that, and thanks for having me. You know what I would add is on the, like there are a lot of cost inflation, but I think the bigger concerns are the infrastructure. I think the cost inflation that you've seen in wages, if you look at top of scale captains at mainline, it really kind of followed the CPI on a, since '94, on a, you know, CPI adjusted basis, they're where they're supposed to be. So I think it's really about some of the infrastructure issues that we've talked about, that there's so much kind of gummed up in the system that's the concern. And then I think kind of to Mike's point about everybody's kind of used this opportunity to kind of improve their balance sheets, or so going into whatever environment we're in, I think a lot of airlines are in better shape to handle whatever is to come. The recession, I remember 2017 to 2019, I had investors telling me the recession was around the corner. And now last year to this year, the recession's been around the corner. I feel like my life has been just waiting for a recession around the corner. And so the other thing I would point out, though, is with this pandemic, it's really thrown out the kind of the playbooks. And I think the reason some airlines are in trouble is because they stuck to recession playbooks and grew into it and thought and didn't kind of foresee some of the infrastructure issues. So some of it is just having to kind of reset themselves. So even kind of the airlines that are in trouble, I think, can reset themselves. But yeah, they're going into this next recession probably in a tougher position.
Great. So all of you have your own financial models for how you look at the airlines and who you cover and how they're doing. When you look at the, as Helene said, you know, the cost increases, the pilot salaries are going up. What does that do? Is this going to separate the airlines from the economic trends in the industry a little bit more? In other words, are those salary increases really going to affect the bottom line in the near term, whether there's a recession or not?
You're looking at me. Yes, yes, because you have to think about covering that cost increase. And to Savi's point, the infrastructure issues don't let you go from 10 hours a day of operation to 14 hours a day. And that's a model that many airlines used for many years, but because of air traffic control delays, pilots running out of time, well, you don't know this, but when I first started, crews and aircraft were kept together all day. They don't do that anymore. These flight attendants go this way, those pilots go that way, and that one flight attendant is done for the day. So because of that, you never really know whether your flight's going to be on time. And then you have the issue of whatever else is going on in the world out there. So you have to raise, in the end, you're going to have to raise fares to cover costs. And there are three ways to do it. You have cargo, and with the pandemic ending and aircraft coming back on long-haul missions, you do have bellies available. And you see that being reflected in FedEx and UPS cutting main deck cargo capacity. Right now, as they had scaled up, they're scaling back. Then you have ancillaries. And then you have basic fares. So there are 3 ways to do it, and you can kind of sneak the fare increases in by charging more for bags or charging for water or whatever you're doing if you're an ultra low cost carrier. But you still have to convince people to get on your plane. And the trend we've seen, more seats per departure and fewer departures per day, should help a little bit, forcing fares up. But I don't know, you might have to be really rich at some point to fly.
Cycle goes back 50 years then to be very rich to fly. What about the other 2?
Yeah, I guess we're going in order across. Look, we're dealing with the worst inflation in 40 years, and so you sort of have to think back, well, what happened 40 years ago, and which carriers actually performed well and which ones didn't? And it was the early 80s, and we had 2 recessions in a 3-year period, and it seemed like a lot of airlines were struggling financially, and we really didn't have much of a low-fare carrier space to speak of. What's interesting today with the inflationary pressures out there, it seems like the models that are the ones that are outperforming are the ones that are probably most exposed to the segments where they can pass on the higher costs into what they sell. And so whether it is cargo, but I know cargo is kind of in a bit of a decline because it got that COVID bump, or ancillary, and that could be things like third-party ground handling, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, things like your credit card program, and then the premium customer. And so when you see somebody like a Delta Airlines saying, hey, 55% of our revenue, or when we're moving towards 60%, is premium or ancillary, you realize a big chunk of their business is a segment that they can pass on that higher cost. But then you look at some of these smaller carriers, the low fare carriers, their entire model, their MO revolves around demand stimulation, and yet if they're going to raise fares to cover these much higher costs, because everybody's dealing with it, what does that do? That doesn't stimulate demand, it destroys demand. And so all of a sudden, the justification for 30% capacity growth doesn't make any sense anymore. They're in over their skis, and now they're losing money at the same time that they're saying it's one of the best demand environments ever, right? Domestic volumes right now are, 5% better than 2019? So you have this, it's very interesting, the world that we're in. So I would suspect that the low fare carriers, and I think it's come up in some of the answers here, is that maybe they didn't totally prepare, like Savi mentioned, the recession playbook. Yeah. I don't think they've actually ever encountered inflation of this magnitude. And so it's going to have, meaningful consequences.
Yeah. So the low fare carriers are been expanding 20+% a year, taking all those low fare customers. But what about the regionals? I mean, Savi, you follow this space. How is the financial health of the regionals when you look at all these other factors?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's been a challenging. Coming out of COVID, I think the regionals were among the first to really recover, and it was looking very good and very positive. And that's what you saw even, I think, after 9/11 and other downturns. Like the regionals are kind of better suited for those kind of smaller demand pockets to get back in there. And obviously the pilot situation, the captain shortage, has really turned that on its head, but that's kind of created opportunities as well. and now you're seeing actually, I think, we're a lot more positive on the regional space. It's going to take a while, but there are definitely airlines that are doing creative things to come out of this. And look, what Helene and Mike have been talking about is the legacy carriers are doing well. Alaska is doing well. And these are the airlines that regional airlines fly for. And so I think that it's that customer base that's doing well. So I think that portends really well for regionals, and probably the reason why you've heard everybody here say that demand is strong for the product. It's really strong. It's just a matter of being able to meet that demand. That's a challenge.
Yeah. So when you look at the regional sector, it's pilot and fleet issues are two of those core issues they're dealing with. When you look at the pilot shortage, honestly, everybody around town here is hyper fixated on everything except the pilot issues and the airline issues. So this is Washington. All three of you are outside Washington. What's your take on the pilot situation, especially for the regionals? I mean, you have perspective on the majors too. They're hiring all the regional pilots. But what's your perspective? Is there a pilot shortage still? And what's the effect?
Do you want to start with Savi?
I'll start with Savi. So you first.
There you go.
You go first.
Like, it is really frustrating,
and
I think it's frustrating how much some of the kind of the pilot unions one, their kind of intellectual dishonesty is going to ringing true in Washington, and that's what they're listening to. And I'm appreciative when I see the RAA emails coming and countering some of the narratives that we're having there, because I read some of the things that I'll kind of square on ALPA that ALPA puts out, and I'm like, there's no intellectual honesty here, and I'm screaming at my computer. And luckily, I'm happy to see that the RAA email that comes out later. And so, it's really disappointing to see DC, but most of the FAA that's not going data-based. I mean, this is kind of an organization that's known for that, and seeing kind of the system getting bogged down over politics more so than kind of information and data, which is what this industry is kind of known to move forward with. Despite that, I think there is some kind of quality forward momentum, at least in solutions that will have longer term positive impacts, unfortunately not short-term benefits. So at least in terms of kind of getting a broader pilot base in here. And you're seeing that at the university level too. I mean, there's just a lot of interest and a lot of people applying to be pilots and mechanics and things like that. So there's definitely the interest in the industry. It's a matter of some of those policies in fixing some of the shorter term issues. And so it's frustrating, I guess, on my end. But generally, I think heading in the right direction from a supply standpoint. But it takes time to fix.
So Mike, is this a supply-demand issue?
Sure. Yeah, no, there is indeed a pilot shortage. And I guess as a DC outsider, I mean, maybe I can sort of look toward DC, and the fact that we have two major legislative deadlines this weekend, both the FAA reauthorization and the whole budget issue. I mean, that in and of itself, when we talk about constraint across the aviation ecosystem, if we don't get a budget deal, then all of a sudden, all the work that's being done to improve, or increase airspace, and whether it's at the airports or it's infrastructure with ATC and hiring controllers, as well as the fact that we may not even get an extension of the FAA or a reauthorization of the FAA if the House and the Senate can't, sort of figure out their differences on, how they view, the appropriate amount of time for pilots. I mean, there's a lot of different issues there. That's exacerbating everything that's going on right now. And so again, as an outsider, I can look in and say, guys, get your act together. The fact that, we could have a situation where the FAA loses its ability to tax, to collect excise taxes starting, early next week. That's money that's needed to invest in infrastructure. The licensing of mechanics, the licensing of pilots, all the training, all that comes to a halt. So that's part of the problem. That needs to be addressed. But in fact, there is a shortage. And in fact, I felt like that was underscored by some of the comments that I heard earlier at this conference from one of the regional carriers that basically said, you look at the number of airplanes that we have grounded. There's several hundred regional jets that are grounded in the U.S. today, and there's cities that are losing service. Guess what? That's a shortage. And they may be small cities, but if you think about it, the US population is 340 million. About 100 million people live in those small cities. And if one union feels like that they want to hold back that service because, I don't know, they're pushing for higher pay, it's very unfortunate. I mean, you have to think about the greater good and an allocation of scarce resources here. Those 100 million people lose out. That's a huge issue.
Yeah, there's a massive number of cities that are added to the list of losing air service, and it all falls on the regionals who can't staff the aircraft. I mean, pilot shortage for you, how real is it?
Well, yes, it's very real, and I would put it at the feet of ALPA and Chuck Schumer. I mean, I think it's completely unacceptable that this man has allowed 50 people to hold hostage the rest of the industry for 20 years. Now, do I sound horrible, right? I sound empathetic, but I'm not. I understand. But that 1,500-hour rule was pulled out of the hat. There was no basis, no scientific basis for saying you have to have 1,500 hours of experience versus 5 or 250 or whatever the number is. And maybe 250 or 500 is not the right number. Maybe 1,500 hours is the right number, but maybe it's something in the middle. And the fact that ALPA has basically created a pilot shortage and has held people in this town hostage for years, to me, is unacceptable. So I will start right there and be kicked off, be put on the no-fly zone, no-fly list going forward. No, I think the other thing is on air traffic control. This country is supposed to be a leader, and we are a follower. We are doing everything by paper. How is this possible? Then in 2023, I've said I was doing this for a long time. I've been doing this for more than 40 years. We talked about it. How is it possible that in 2023 I am writing the exact same stuff I was writing in 1982 when I first started? I mean, it's like insane. Only then, instead of we were talking about 3 crew, 3 engine aircraft going to 2 crew, 2 engine aircraft. We were hush kidding 727s. I mean, it's same issues, just sort of different plane types. But yeah, the pilot shortage back then was resolved by going to 2 crews and 2 engines. And I know all aircraft, I mean, I'm not like completely an airhead. I know all aircraft are certified for 2 pilots in the cockpit. I get that. But the way pilots are going and the way they're pricing themselves, eventually automation will take over. And that's what's happening elsewhere in the world. It's what will happen here. And the fact that I'm so passionate about this subject because the fact that it hasn't happened, and I've been writing the same stuff about FAA and air traffic control for 40 years, is just so disheartening. And the technology is there. Airlines were early adopters of technology. That's part of why they all had those big mainframes for years and years. But then they all went bankrupt and in and out of financial issues and blah, blah, blah. And so they wound up just not having the money to invest in keeping the technology up to date. But Brian, I think, made a comment earlier about the eVTOL pilots requiring 1,500 hours. That means the industry's dead on arrival. China is there. They're already certified with EHang and their aircraft. EASA is there. They're planning to, with Volocopter, with Lilium, with Vertical, they're planning to use eVTOLs in Paris next summer for the Olympics. And the US is just a laggard, and I think the world looks at this country to lead, and I think we're more of a laughingstock with all the fights that seem, as an outsider, so petty. Like grow up and get to the middle.
Well, two out of the 3 of you have brought up ALPA and some of the disinformation that's out there. You had a, however you put it.
3 Mike was a little bit more diplomatic about it.
He didn't specifically reference ALPA, but I know you're on the same page. You're on the same page, right?
Well, there is a shortage.
Yes.
Yeah, unequivocally, there is a pilot shortage in the United States today.
But I find it interesting. I wasn't planning on asking you about ALPA or that side of the issue. But the conversation is there a pilot shortage or isn't there? 99% of everybody believes there's a pilot shortage, and then ALPA is the outlier. And now one of their talking points is we need a 2-pilot cockpit always and forever because that's the safest thing and we don't ever want to be unsafe. And to me, that's kind of like in the past where you said, well, horses are far better than cars. We don't need to take the chance with this newfangled technology. Yet we have driverless cars. I mean, a friend of mine just got picked up yesterday in a driverless Uber. Like, wow, this is where we're going. Does the automobile industry really lead on all these issues? I mean, is that where we're at because ALPA's gumming up the works?
It's a little easier on the technology will eventually catch up, right? And the regulation will catch up. I think talking about cargo passengers not complaining about turboprops, they don't complain about not having a pilot in front as well. So I think you're going to see it slowly in areas that are easier to implement, or maybe even in flights in remote areas that are desperate for it. So I think that will come. It's just a little easier to kind of implement it in certain areas, but it is. Look, safety is paramount, and everybody here, I think, would agree. So you move slower in the aviation industry, and I think that's what's reflective here. And over time, I guess I'm more optimistic that despite what ALPA is trying to do right now, and they're taking advantage of a moment in time where they do have a lot of negotiating leverage. and that too shall pass, and I think we'll move forward.
Well, everybody's gotten the huge pay increases, right? They've been successful, so now what? You know, it's almost as if the airlines have to then recover from these massive pay increases. And you know, my dad was an airline pilot. Pay everybody what they're worth, but don't take down the industry. Is that one of your concerns? Is that some of this will just bankrupt some smaller carriers?
I want to. Well, it's not just. I think it's just overall inflation. Costs for everything are going up. Whether you throw a bag, whether you're a pilot, flight attendant, mechanics, these inflationary pressures, I mean, they're going to be sustained. And it's things like insurance and financing costs and airport costs. And sure, interest rates will come down, so financing costs will come down. But when I think about, you know, the weakness that we're seeing among many of the low-fare carriers because they're dealing with the same issues, we may have seen the peak when we think about the percentage of people who can afford to travel by air. That may be the bigger issue here. So, you know, you go back and you read these Southwest press releases years ago. They talk about that when they were formed in the early 1970s and how they revolutionized air travel. I think, you know, in the old press releases, they would say something like 20 to 25% of all Americans in the early 70s had been on an airplane at least once in that person's lifetime. And I think we got to the structural limit probably around now. You know, we're probably in the high 70s, low 80s, and people are like, well, why can't we go higher than 80%? And some of it is just that, you know, people are afraid to fly. They're never going to fly. People, you know, are just, they don't have any money, right? They're at or below the poverty line. They're incarcerated. They don't have the freedom to fly. So, you know, those are probably why we don't go above the 80%. But as we think forward, it could be that air travel, and Mike, you said this earlier, maybe not going back 50 years, but do we go back to the point where, you know, maybe only 65 or 70% of all Americans can afford to fly? Because low-fare carriers, some of them we know for sure their models aren't sustainable. Some are actually fine. And so maybe we've seen the peak. And again, I point to the number of cities that have lost air service and the number of Americans who don't have the frequency of air service that they had as recently as 15 years ago.
Right.
That's the downside.
I guess the more optimistic, I think we might come to Mike's world, but then we'll probably get out of it as technology catches up. I think there's, just especially with some of these eVTOL electrification, it's not going to get to the long hauls that, you know, you might start to get service that you lost some time ago in the very short haul markets. And so, and they'll be done in a very much cheaper way. They don't have a lot of moving parts, and so it's, you know, it's a lot cheaper. So maybe technology will save us, but first we'll have to go through the world where we lose a lot of service first.
I did want to touch on fleet issues and specifically some of the decisions. So it's no secret the 50-seaters are going away, just as the Beech 1900s, the 19-seaters are gone. So we're having a point where there is no replacement aircraft for a lot of the aircraft flying. And yes, Embraer makes a fantastic product, as was mentioned before, and they are a major supplier and they always will be. But when you look at the fleet decisions that the regional airlines need to make, where are we in that cycle where they're going to have to say, as Linda Markham from Cape Air said a little bit earlier, Cape Air may be the ideal candidate for an electric aircraft. There are other regionals that could be. Tim Comberich's, you know, FedEx operation may be part of that too. So where are we in that decision cycle for fleet, and when do some of those decisions need to be made for replacing aircraft, even those parked?
Well, I'll say now, right? I mean, aircraft, when you think about aircraft, they have a 20 to 30 year life. So if you're buying a plane in 20, and it takes what, 18 months or more? I mean,
right.
We're talking about smaller planes here, so maybe 18 months to 3 years before you get your first one. So you're talking 2026 to 2046. And by then we have to be close to zero, net zero, because of the 2050 deadline. I think Savi has a really interesting point, because as I said earlier, the infrastructure issues at airports means more seats per departure and fewer departures per day. And in fact, Delta, on one of their last earnings calls, 2 calls ago, talked about that. And that's becoming more mainstream. Airlines are thinking more along that line. And you know, you mentioned the 19-seaters, 13, 19, 30-seat aircraft are all going away. But to Savi's point, you don't necessarily want to drive 3 or 4 hours to the nearest medium-sized airport, and your airport has lost service. And right now, eVTOLs, I think, are planned to go, depending on the one, no more than 100 miles. But that can solve a big problem because they're all being designed with one, most of them are being designed either with no or one pilot in the cockpit. So I think that can help solve some of those issues. And I think that's why you see a lot of the regional airlines thinking about, you know, what aircraft can we use that's cost effective, that's sustainable. You know, all engines burn SAF at this point, but it's not scalable yet. The Inflation Reduction Act hopefully helps that out. And the electrification of the aircraft, I think, I don't know how we're going to get, you know, 1,000 of them in the air all at the same time with everything else that's out there, but maybe they'll just have to fly lower.
True. So you've obviously looked at this issue. You've looked at where do you think the first new aircraft players are going to, I mean, Joby, as was mentioned in the last panel, just delivered an aircraft.
Look, Joby and Archer are really kind of intra-cities where the focus is, right? You have to get to like Alice or something like that when you're looking for further out. But the technology will improve over time. The battery will allow the distance to come through. But yeah, initially, I think intra-cities where you see most of it. But you do have on like the cargo movement front where you'll see the hybrid options where, you know, one pilot and you can kind of do these low emission cargo flights and things like that. So I think it's just going to be in pockets, and then slowly the radius will grow. And I think you'll gain a lot of momentum, not in this decade, in the next decade, but there's just you had lightning in a bottle in that industry where you saw a lot of capital move in and it really expand the time that industry. I mean, it was very slow going, and suddenly you had the capital infusion, and I think you're starting to get to some exciting times. But to really see a lot of it, I think it's in the next decade.
Mike, your thoughts on the next generation
You know,
of aircraft?
they covered a lot. I would say the way the economics sort of drive, it would seem like that the appropriate platform for a lot of this new technology would be the regional level. And so I know you said Beechcrafts, you know, the 1900Ds going away and the Saab 340s. But you look at, you know, Hart Aerospace, you know, and you look at some of these other battery, you know, powered type operations. They have, if there are battery propulsion systems, they have to be small, right? 9-seaters, 9-seaters, 15-seaters, 30-seaters. So it would seem like that as that technology is introduced, because I think everybody is focused on getting to carbon neutrality by 2050, it would seem natural that the regionals would play a role in that new technology. And that would be beyond, you know, that's beyond kind of an Archer or Joby, you know, the intercity stuff. Yeah. That would be something where it's 100 to 300 miles, and then therefore, you know, providing opportunities again for some of these small cities that have lost service. You can see a lot of the big airlines are behind, you know, backing some of these different models, as well as some of the regional carriers like Mesa's investment in Hart Aerospace.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen in dealing with on the airport side, I've had a number of airport clients, is that there's a surprising number of airports that are now saying, okay, how can we integrate a Joby aircraft, a Lilium aircraft? It's not a should we, it's a how are we going to integrate it? So there seems to be a lot of work being done throughout the United States about, you know, we need to have this type of land set aside, we need to have this electrification element to it, and, you know, what's that going to look like? So there is a lot of work. I just wonder who's going to be first, and maybe it's on the cargo side, as you said.
Cargo, always watch, well, first watch government, right? Watch Department of Defense. They're usually first, they lead. Then watch cargo, to Savi's point, and then you see it in passengers. But I think Cape Air, Linda didn't really get a chance to talk that much about it. They're on the leading edge of some of this because of their route network and the fact that they don't have some of the issues some of the other regionals have. They're actually on the leading edge of a lot of electric aircraft and testing and so on. So I think you'll see, you know, really interesting things coming out of that, them and others over the next few years.
Great. If anybody has a question in the audience, just raise your hand. I'll take a look. Just letting the AV people know in the back, there's no more timer here, so I don't know when the panel's ending. We got a question right here. Just stand up and shout it out.
Good afternoon. My name is Bo Ellis. I'm one of the executive members of Let Experienced Pilots Fly Coalition, and we're working on trying to raise age 65 to 67 to provide immediate relief for the excess of pilots at the top end of the industry. And I want to thank you all for being completely honest and candid about our union leadership and their disinformation campaign. Very frustrating for us. We've met with over 250 legislators on Capitol Hill, shared our story with them, shared the facts, shared the data, which is all independent sources and references. And we're being told that we get it, we understand it, but you have to get your union to change their mind and position, which is almost impossible for where we're at because we're outnumbered by the other pilots. And so, as he said, there's some other objectives by our union that doesn't match up with our future and our careers. So I want to thank you for being honest. It's refreshing to hear that because quite often every time we read something in the newspaper or see on TV, it's very frustrating to us and being told. So this is our thank you from our, we've got several thousand pilots behind the scenes working with us. We all thank you, so thank you very much.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
And your website, again, which I do follow?
Called RaiseThePilotAge.com.
RaiseThePilotAge.com. You guys have done great work, so
We're still working on it.
that's great. Anything else? I do have a timer here, thanks. What about, I'm just curious, and I've actually always been curious back when I was a reporter and dealing with you guys. When you look at an industry like the regional industry, what are some of those elements of your models that are important, that may not be as important for the major carriers? What do you actually look at on a regular basis? Maybe it's broad economic issues, maybe it's fleet a little bit more than you look at elsewhere, but I mean, what's critical when you look at the regional industry?
You should let Mike start.
Good management. So I know you can't put that into a model,
Really?
but good leadership. And there's some very thoughtful and progressive, forward-looking leaders out there at some of the key regionals, really pushing the envelope. So that's super important. And I would say consistency too. You get a lot of turnover in companies. To see some of the same leaders. I saw, like, for example, Rick Leach at GoJet, doesn't head a public company, but we've been following, him for years, back to his Transstates days. He's a survivor. He understands this industry. When I heard him present earlier about him going out with his recruiting people, it would be odd to have a CEO go on a recruiting trip, but the fact is that's where, that's the pain point right now in the industry, right? Not enough pilots, not enough mechanics. To be out there and spending time, that's very important. So to me, I guess you can't really model that. So that would be what's in my theoretical model, my intangible model.
But it gives you the confidence for SkyWest. There's all these carriers.
Republic. Brian was up here earlier,
Brian.
another thought leader. Some of the things he was trying to do with their flight academy, trying to really, think outside of the box. He didn't succeed, but you have to take risks in life.
But if you looked at the longevity of airline CEOs, wouldn't the regionals all be at the top?
For sure, yeah, some of them, yeah.
What about you, Savi? What else do you look at?
I guess I was just thinking of what do I look at for regionals that I don't necessarily look at for mainline. The interesting thing was, I think pre-pandemic, I would have said pilot supply. I've done a lot of work on pilot supply related to regionals, but now I feel like I have to do that work for the mainline as well. So that's kind of changed. And scope clause, that's another big thing that we pay a lot of attention to, and just operations, right? I mean, I think one of the big changes, or actually more so less operations and more so kind of the mainline mentality and approach, because I think that's one of the big changes that happened that really made a difference for the regional industry is the mainline's going from, hey, we want the lowest cost producer, and let's kind of have a race to the bottom, to really providing a product. So the other thing that we really focus on is what are mainline goals and aspirations and views and how, because that does drive a lot of how the regionals succeed, I think.
Right. Anything to add?
Well, this is what got me uninvited the last time.
No, it won't happen.
So the regionals are an ACMI provider, right? They provide the aircraft, the maintenance, the crew, and the insurance. And the main lines provide the revenue. They sell 100% of their seats to their mainline partners. So I think it's really important. Everything that Mike and Savi said, I totally agree with. But when we're doing our modeling, we're really focused on what the staying power of the main line is, and the revenue generation ability. Like what really got me uninvited was that I said that I thought giving up 100% of your revenue production to a third party was not in the best interest of yourself, that there had to have been a better way to do that. So, like, yes, not worrying about fuel cost is wonderful, but at the time, I mean, Savi mentioned that it was a race to the bottom, but there was a point in time when the regionals had much higher margins, double-digit margins, 15, 18% margins, to the majors losing money. And that's when the majors flipped and said, wait a minute, we are not doing this anymore. Your margins are going to be capped at 8% or 5%. And then they started, to Savi's point, pushing them down. We want the lowest cost producer, so on and so forth. And then it turned out the lowest cost producer can't survive. And so they've kind of backed away from that, and we are where we are. But we look at the model. We look at the numbers. What are your input costs? Sure. What are you getting to cover that cost? And how are you able to raise your revenue as your costs are going up while you're in a multi-year contract? So that's where I come out on it.
That's a good point. It's always irked me to some degree, to your point about the majors regionals relationship. Hopefully this won't get me in trouble with Faye or anybody else. Is that the majors are siphoning, are gathering in droves all these pilots from the regionals, and then they're holding the regionals to the metrics that they said, well, you should be flying more, but you've taken all of our pilots. I mean, that's one of those things that people don't really talk about. Yeah. But they're actively going out and recruiting the regional pilots, and then being, millions of dollars of penurious, I guess is the term, penalties on the regionals. I mean, can that continue for the regionals? Does there need to be somebody that separates?
Well, they've started to do that. They've started to offer the pilots a pathway through the regionals to the majors. But just because SkyWest, for an example, might have an agreement with United, it doesn't mean that Spirit can't come along and steal those pilots. It just means United won't take those pilots. And to your point, that's exactly what's happened. We've been working on the pilot situation since 2014. I wrote my first report on there is a pilot shortage looming in December of 2013, and it just got exacerbated by the pandemic and everything else. But in the fairness, in the interest of being fair, not that we have to be, remember in April of 2020, there was no guarantee the government was going to save the airline industry. At the time, it just looked like the government was going to let the industry fail. Sarah Nelson and Doug Parker almost single-handedly convinced the government to support the industry. And then everybody complains that they used their money to lay off people. Well, they didn't, right? To offer incentive buyouts and so on. I just think that there are ways to save the issue. A lot of pilots work till they're 65, but some retire at 59 or 60 or 62. On one conference call, I had asked American, you have pilots who left at 62. Can't you go back and hire them for 5 years or 4 years or 3, whatever they have remaining? And the answer is no, it would take too much to train them. We don't want to do that. But I know other airlines will hire them. Yeah, FedEx has got 600 too many pilots right now. Wow. They just don't want to retire because of the contract that's open.
Hear that? Anybody hiring pilots? FedEx has too many?
They have 600 too many.
Wow. My brother was just offered, he's 59, he was just offered 2 different airlines tried to recruit him because he's got 2,000 hours.
Yeah. I'm on the advisory board of a small airline in Miami, and we will direct captain hire anybody under 65.
Wow.
Right into the direct captain seat, because in order to grow, it's a charter, cargo, passenger charter. In order to grow it, you need to have some pilots.
I think at the end of the day, though, the mainline the enlightened mainline realizes that they have to support the regionals. So it really is more like the airlines that really work in partnership are the ones that succeed more. And I think you've seen that. And there have been some mainline airlines that have done that better than others. And then you see it in their results, you see it in their operations, you see it in their cost. And so, I mean, I think that's a trick. Yes, you have had airlines that hire away and then penalize the regionals, but more often, I think, and it goes back to Mike's point about leadership's important, because the leadership's job is to make sure that you have that good partnership with your mainline partner. And then again, there are some mainline partners that are more enlightened than others, and I think they do better as a result.
Yeah, Mike, I think to follow on both of their points, Savi and Helene's points, is that even after all of the airplanes being parked and all of the restructuring that we've seen, I mean, I ran these numbers. September quarter, the regionals accounted, at least for the big three, so we're not including Alaska, they represented 40% of domestic seats on a marketing basis. Or excuse me, 40% of flights, 20% of seats, and like 10%, 11% of ASMs. So, and it obviously less on ASMs because they tend to fly shorter haul. But, you know, I remember asking American this question, God, I don't even, you know, a few years back, you know, how much of your load factor is derived from regional feed? And they were like 10 to 12 points. And then some of the international flights, it's like 15 percentage points of load factor. And that tends to be much higher premium than, you know, that New York, Florida flight. So, you know, you start thinking about that. The life and death between success and failure in the airline industry is like 3 or 4 load factor points. Right. So if you're getting 10 to 15 points from your regional partner, you know, you don't want to, you know, you certainly don't want to, you know, poison the well or, you know, destabilize that relationship. So I think, like, to their points, you know, these companies figure out that at the end of the day, it's positive, it's a symbiotic relationship. Both, you know, you'll thrive if your regional partners thrive.
I think there was probably a period well, even before the pandemic was over and everybody was hiring, that it was a feeding frenzy and you'd hire anywhere. And they've gotten a little bit smarter about that as they want that regional feed to be solid and consistent. We're just about out of time. Any other questions from the field or? Okay.
Here's one in the back.
Go ahead. We can't hear. Is there a microphone?
For the 50.
There's one over here.
Yes, Simon from ATR, you know, the aircraft manufacturer. So you mentioned earlier that you don't see any replacement possibility for the aging 50 regional jets. Why are not you mentioning the ATR product? We are still in production, comfortable aircraft. You don't see any future for the turboprop for the regional market?
The turboprops. I think you're asking about turboprops in the U.S.?
Yes,
As a
replacing
replacement for the
50-seater
50-seaters.
regional jets aircraft, yes.
Yeah. I don't know. In the U.S., people don't, I think it was mentioned in one of the earlier panels, people don't like to get on those planes. They don't trust them as much as they should. Europe has much greater success rate in placing those aircraft. And don't you do a deal, don't you have a cargo version that FedEx operates?
So we do, and FedEx is taking 30 of them plus 20 on option.
Right.
And we have improved our product. We burn 45% less fuel than regional jets, similar size. So there is already a solution to reduce the impact on the environment. We have improved also, we have connectivity inside of cabin. We have a glass cockpit. So there is already a modern, comfortable solution to replace aging fleets. So I know there is this tendency in the US not trusting the turboprop product, but we have improved. We have invested in our product. And yes, we are trying to tackle this misperception as turboprop being unsafe and not modern and not comfortable, because this is not the case. And you see airlines like Indigo in India, they keep getting new aircraft, so we are economically very viable. So yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, if you look at Archer and all of the Joby, everybody coming up, they're all turboprop-based aircraft. So you look at the next generation as really turboprop, and so you're going to see that cycle come back again.
Yes,
Quiet, though.
and we do work.
What?
quiet, though.
Quiet.
Quiet
Yes.
aircraft.
Yes, we are also
Just
very quiet. We are working on the next generation aircraft. We have launched, this study about the EVO project. So we are also working on this next generation aircraft, yes.
That's great.
That's
Great.
So any last comments about everything we've talked about, or are you fine with it?
All right.
Okay.
I mean, aviation's wonderful.
Aviation is great, ignore the rest of it. So thank you very much. Please give a round of applause to Helene, Mike, and Savi.